She was 19 and owned nothing but the clothes on her back and a small, carved bird in her pocket. Her uncle had given her $20 and pointed her toward the road, a quiet dismissal that felt colder than any shout. And with that $20, she bought the deed to the useless, rusted-out water tower at the edge of Red Hollow, a joke of a property that earned her nothing but pity and scorn. But what nobody in that town knew was that sealed inside the great iron tank was a secret, a chamber left by a man long dead, and that secret would change her life and the town forever. Settle in and let us know where you're watching from tonight, as we tell the story of Clara Whitfield. Clara Whitfield grew up in the quiet, precise world of her father's workshop. Thomas Whitfield was a watchmaker, a man who measured his life in the steady tick and tock of a well-made escapement. Their small home behind the shop smelled of mineral oil, brass shavings, and the faint, clean scent of the alcohol he used to clean the delicate clockworks. While other girls learned stitching and baking, Clara learned the names of tools that sounded like poetry. The staking set, the depthing tool, the mainspring winder. Her hands, small and steady, became accustomed to the feel of tweezers handling a hairspring no thicker than a spider's silk, and the patient pressure required to set a jewel into a bridge. Her father was a quiet man, his love expressed not in grand pronouncements, but in the way he would guide her hand, his calloused finger gently correcting the angle of a screwdriver. He taught her to see the world as a series of interconnected systems, a grand and intricate machine. "Everything has a purpose, Clara," he would say, his voice a low murmur against the backdrop of a dozen ticking clocks. "You just have to be patient enough to find it." He taught her about pressure and leverage, about the transfer of energy, and about how the smallest gear could drive the largest wheel. He taught her to listen for the wrong sound, the subtle friction that signaled a coming failure, and to respect the integrity of a well-designed structure. Her mother had passed from a fever when Clara was only 6, a hazy memory of a warm lap and a soft song, leaving Clara and her father a quiet, self-sufficient unit of two. On her 10th birthday, he had given her a small bird, carved from a single piece of basswood. It wasn't a perfect carving. The wings were a little uneven, the tail slightly askew, but he had spent a week of evenings on it, and when he placed it in her palm, its weight felt like a promise. It became her most treasured possession, a small, tangible piece of his patient, focused love. Then, a year ago, a sickness had settled in his lungs, a slow, rattling decay that no medicine could fix. The doctor's visits and tonics consumed their meager savings, and Thomas Whitfield passed away, leaving Clara an orphan at 18. Her father's brother, Arthur, took her in. Arthur was a man of commerce, the proprietor of a bustling dry goods store in the next town over. He was everything his brother was not: loud, impatient, and a firm believer that the only value in the world could be recorded in the black ink of a ledger. He saw his brother's life as a failure, a foolish waste of time spent on useless trinkets. He saw Clara as another of his brother's debts, a mouth to feed, a line item in the column of his losses. She lived in a small attic room above the store and tried to make herself useful, quietly fixing a faulty scale with a bit of wire, adjusting the hinge on a heavy cellar door so it no longer scraped the floor, but Arthur never acknowledged her skill. He saw only her presence, a silent, constant reminder of the brother he had never understood and the financial burden she represented. The end of her life in her uncle's house came not with a fight, but with the quiet finality of a business transaction. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the air in Arthur's small office thick with the scent of stale paper and cigar smoke. He sat behind his heavy oak desk, his gaze fixed on the open ledger before him, not on the young woman standing opposite. "Clara," he began, his voice flat and devoid of warmth, "you are 19 years of age. A woman grown I have seen to my duty as your guardian, and now it is time for you to have a life of your own." He dipped his pen in the inkwell and made a neat, precise notation in a column of figures before continuing. "I have made an arrangement for you, a good one. Mr. Abernathy has made an offer of marriage." Clara's stomach tightened. Mr. Abernathy was a merchant from 2 towns over, A man twice her age with a wet mouth, 3 unruly children from his first wife, and a way of looking at her that made her skin crawl. He appraised her the same way he appraised a bolt of cloth or a sack of flour, his eyes calculating her value. He is a man of some means, her uncle continued, still not looking at her. He has a good house. You will be provided for. You will have security. He presented it as an act of generosity, a final kindness to settle his account. Clara stood perfectly still, her hands clasped behind her back. She could feel the smooth wood of the carved bird in her pocket, a silent anchor in a churning sea. She thought of the life he was describing. Mr. Abernathy's house, his children, his heavy hands. It was not a life. It was a cage, polished and furnished, but a cage nonetheless. "Is there another choice?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the stuffy silence of the room. For the first time, Arthur looked up, his eyes cold and direct. "The other choice," he said, leaning back in his chair, "is that you make your own way in the world. Your time here is at an end regardless. I have done my part." He opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out a small stack of bills, laying them on the polished wood. "This is $20, a severance you might call it, for your work here." He pushed the money toward her, a clear and final gesture of dismissal. He was not just sending her away. He was purchasing his freedom from the obligation of her existence. Clara looked at the money, then at the hard set of her uncle's face. She saw no room for appeal, no flicker of doubt or familial affection. This was a ledger being balanced, a debt being paid. There would be no tears, no pleading. Her father had taught her to recognize a mechanism that could not be repaired, and her uncle's heart was just such a thing. With a quiet dignity that seemed to surprise him, she reached out and took the money. "I understand," she said. An hour later, she was in her small attic room, packing her few belongings into a canvas satchel. A change of clothes, a photograph of her father smiling in his workshop, and the small wooden bird. She closed her hand around the carving, one last time, before tucking it deep into her pocket. She walked down the stairs and out the back door of the store without another word, leaving behind the only home she had known for the past year, stepping out into the vast, uncertain world. She walked west, away from the town where her uncle lived, and toward a horizon that offered nothing but distance. The sun was hot on the back of her neck, and the dust from the road coated her worn boots and the hem of her dress. The $20 in her pocket felt both like a fortune and like nothing at all, a fragile buffer against a world that had no place for her. She walked for 2 days, the landscape shifting from sparse farmland to the high, arid plains that stretched out under an immense and indifferent blue sky. She slept one night curled in a dry arroyo, the stars a cold, distant canopy above her, and bought a loaf of bread and a wedge of hard cheese at a lonely crossroads store, the purchase making a significant dent in her small funds. On the 3rd day, she saw the town of Red Hollow. It appeared first as a smudge of brown and gray in the distance, a place that seemed to be holding on by a thread. As she drew closer, she saw it was a town of forgotten things. The buildings were weathered to a silver gray, their paint long since scoured away by wind and sun. The single main street was wide and dusty, populated by a few listless souls who moved with the slow, weary pace of people who had given up on expecting anything better. It was a place where things ended up, not where they began. And at the westernmost edge of the town, standing on a small, barren plot of land, was the water tower. It was a skeletal giant, a monument to a time when the town had perhaps held more promise. It was made of iron, and rust ran down its sides in long, weeping streaks of orange and brown, like a map of all the storms it had endured. The great cylindrical tank sat high atop 4 spindly legs, a silent, brooding presence against the pale sky. Most people, Clara knew, would see it as an eyesore, a piece of junk, a symbol of decay. But as she stood looking at it, her father's lessons stirred within her. She saw not just rust, but a structure. She saw the elegant geometry of the support legs, the logic of the cross-bracing, the sheer, stubborn integrity of the riveted steel. It was neglected, but it was not broken. She walked into the town proper, to a small, clapboard building with a faded sign that read Town Hall and Recorder's Office. Inside, a stooped, elderly clerk, with spectacles perched on the end of his nose, looked up from a large, dusty book. "Help you?" he asked, his voice thin and reedy. "I was wondering about the old water tower," Clara said. The clerk, whose nameplate identified him as Mr. Hemlock, gave a dry chuckle. "The town's folly? Been empty for 30 years, miss. Ever since they drilled the new well east of town. Useless thing on a useless plot of land. Too rocky for a garden, too far out for a business." "Is it for sale?" Clara asked. Mr. Hemlock took off his spectacles and polished them with a corner of his vest, his surprise evident. "For sale? Well, I suppose it is. The town took it for back taxes a decade ago, been on the books ever since." He shuffled through a stack of papers, his fingers stirring up small clouds of dust. "Says here the outstanding lien is $20. He looked at her over the rims of his glasses, a twinkle of amusement in his eyes. He thought it was a fine joke. "You give the town $20, and the deed is yours. You'd be doing us a favor, getting it off the rolls." Clara laid her entire fortune on the worn wooden counter. The 4 $5 bills looked small and tired. Mr. Hemlock's smile faded slightly as he realized she was serious. He slowly took the money, wrote out a receipt, and then stamped and signed a brittle, yellow deed with a flourish. Clara folded the document and placed it in her satchel. When she walked out of the office, she was no longer a homeless wanderer. She was a property owner. The few townspeople who had witnessed the transaction from the street corner whispered to each other and smiled, shaking their heads at the foolishness of the strange young woman. Clara paid them no mind. She walked toward her property, her tower, feeling the solid ground beneath her feet in a way she never had before. Clara approached her new domain not as a ruin, but as a complex piece of machinery waiting for a careful hand. She spent the rest of that first day in a slow, methodical inspection, her senses alive to the details others had long since ignored. The 4 great legs were made of latticed steel beams, anchored in massive concrete footings. She ran her hands over the concrete. It was cracked and weathered, but a few solid taps with a heavy rock told her the core was sound. The foundations were good. The rust that covered the steel was a beautiful, terrible tapestry of reds and oranges, but she knew the difference between surface corrosion and deep, structural decay. She found a spot on a lower beam where the rust had flaked away and saw the dark, healthy gray of the iron beneath. The tower had been built to last. She walked the perimeter, her gaze tracing the lines of the structure up to the sky. The ladder that ran up one of the legs was made of heavy iron rungs set into the steel. She tested the lowest one, putting her full weight on it. It groaned but held firm. She would have to check each one on her way up, but the path was there. At the base of the tower, nestled between 2 of the legs, was a small, dilapidated pump house. Its wooden door hung from a single rusted hinge, and the corrugated iron roof was peeling up at one corner. Inside, the pump itself was long gone, probably sold for scrap, leaving behind only dark stains on the concrete floor and the ghosts of mounting bolts. The space was small, no more than 10 feet square, but it had 4 walls and most of a roof. It would be her first shelter. She found a stout, discarded branch and used it as a broom, sweeping out decades of accumulated dirt, leaves, and animal nests. The work was hard and dirty, but with every stroke, she was claiming the space as her own. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the tower in a long, dramatic shadow across the dry earth, Clara sat on one of the concrete footings, her back against the cool steel. From this vantage point, she could see the entire structure as a single entity. She saw the main inlet pipe, a huge cast-iron tube rising from the ground, its end capped with a heavy bolted flange. She saw the equally large outlet pipe, designed to feed a town that no longer needed it. She saw the elegant, simple engineering of it all, a design meant to do one job perfectly: hold water against the pull of the earth. The townspeople of Red Hollow saw a useless relic, a monument to failure. Clara Whitfield saw a challenge. She saw a system waiting to be understood, and, perhaps, to be brought back to life. She felt a profound sense of peace settle over her, a feeling of rightness that she hadn't known since her father's death. She had a place. It was made of rust and iron and forgotten purpose, but it was hers. She had a foothold, anchored deep in the rocky soil of Red Hollow. The next morning, under a pale and cloudless sky, Clara began her ascent. The iron rungs of the ladder were cold and rough beneath her palms. She tested each one before trusting it with her weight, her movements careful and deliberate, just as her father had taught her. The higher she climbed, the more the world of Red Hollow shrank below, the dusty street and weathered rooftops becoming a miniature map. A steady wind whistled through the steel lattice, a high, lonely sound. She was 50 feet up when she finally pulled herself onto the narrow catwalk that encircled the base of the giant tank. From here, the world felt vast and open. She walked the circumference, her hand trailing along the cold, curved wall of riveted steel, feeling the immense, solid presence of the thing. On the conical roof above, she found the main access hatch, a heavy iron disc held down by a ring of thick bolts. They were rusted solid, frozen by 30 years of sun and rain. This was the first true test of her skill and her patience. She climbed down, retrieved a small, adjustable wrench she had found in the pump house, and with the last of her coins, bought a small tin of penetrating oil from the town's general store. The work was slow and arduous. For hours, she sat perched on the roof of the world, applying oil, waiting, and then putting all her strength into turning the wrench. One by one, with a groan of protesting metal, the nuts began to yield. Finally, the last one came free. With a deep breath, she heaved the heavy hatch open. The air that rose from within was cool and ancient, smelling of dry rust and absolute darkness. She lowered herself carefully into the cavernous space. The interior of the tank was a vast, echoing bowl of steel. A single column of light from the open hatch pierced the gloom, illuminating a thick blanket of reddish-brown dust that coated the concave floor. As her eyes adjusted, she began to make out the curve of the walls and the intricate pattern of rivets. It was then that she saw it. Across the vast curve of the tank wall, about 4 feet from the floor, was a section of steel plate that was subtly different from the rest. The seam was a perfect rectangle, and the rivet pattern around it was tighter, more precise. It was almost invisible, a secret hidden in plain sight. She ran her fingers over the faint outline. In the very center was a small, recessed square, no bigger than her thumb, a keyhole made not for a key, but for a specific tool. Her mind flashed back to her father's workbench, to the custom-made tools he had fashioned for unique and difficult jobs. She knew this was a lock, a mechanism of purpose and intent. She climbed out of the tank and back down the long ladder. In the debris around the pump house, she found a discarded length of hardened steel rod. She took it into her new workshop and, using a rusty file she'd also salvaged, began the painstaking process of shaping the end of the rod. For the rest of the day, she worked, filing the metal down, testing the fit in her mind, her hands remembering the lessons of her father. By late afternoon, she had fashioned a tool, a square-headed key. She climbed the tower again, her heart beating with a mixture of hope and trepidation. She slipped into the tank, crossed the dusty floor, and inserted her handmade key into the square recess. It was a perfect fit. She turned it. Deep within the wall, there was a heavy, satisfying clunk as a hidden bolt retracted. With a low groan of metal on metal, the rectangular plate swung inward on massive, silent hinges, revealing a dark, man-sized opening. It was a chamber, an airtight room built into the very structure of the tank. Inside, sitting on a low wooden shelf, was a heavy, sea-worn chest. It was not locked. With trembling hands, Clara lifted the lid. The chest was filled with neatly bundled stacks of old banknotes and several canvas bags that clinked with the heavy, muffled sound of coins. On top of it all lay a sealed tin box. She carried the box to the column of light beneath the hatch and pried it open. Inside was a letter, folded and tucked beside a small, beautiful brass sextant and a silver locket. She unfolded the brittle paper and began to read. The script was the elegant, looping hand of another era. My name is Elias Vance. I was the engineer who designed and built this tower in the year 1888. This money is my life savings, the result of 20 years of work. I was cheated of my final payment by a corrupt town council and had to leave this place with nothing but the clothes on my back. I could not carry this, so I built this chamber, a secret place I hoped to one day return to. If you are reading this, then I never made it back. The money is yours, a reward for a keen eye and a curious mind. I lost my wife and daughter to fever years ago, and I have no one to leave this to. Use it to build a good life for yourself. Remember that a structure is only as strong as its foundation. Build a strong one. Clara sat in the silent, dusty tank, the letter in her hand, and felt a profound connection to the man she had never known. His story of betrayal, of quiet competence, of providing for a future he might never see. It was a story that echoed her own. It was a message of hope, left in a vessel of iron, a legacy from one builder to another. Clara's first act was one of preservation, not proclamation. She carefully returned the chest to its hidden chamber, swung the heavy steel door shut, and turned her key, sealing Elias Vance's secret once more. She descended the tower with a single gold coin in her pocket, its weight a dense and solid promise. In town, she walked into the general store, run by a dour man named Silas Croft. When she placed the coin on the counter to pay for a sack of flour, a new hammer, and a box of nails, he picked it up, bit it, and stared at her with a new, calculating expression. The coin was real. Word in a town like Red Hollow traveled faster than a prairie fire. The strange girl who had bought the useless tower had money. The snickers and whispers of pity faded, replaced by a thick, watchful curiosity. Her rebuilding began not with the tower, but with the small pump house that was her home. She bought milled lumber, a pane of glass for the empty window frame, and a sturdy new door. For the work, she sought out Jebediah, a quiet, grizzled carpenter in his 60s, with hands as gnarled as old wood, but a reputation for honest, meticulous work. He was a man with more skill than employment. She did not simply hire him. She became his apprentice, working alongside him from dawn until dusk. She learned to measure twice and cut once, the right way to brace a frame, the clean, satisfying scent of fresh sawn pine. Jebediah, a man of few words, was impressed by her focus and her innate understanding of structure. He began to nod at her in the street, a small gesture of respect that was worth more than any coin. With her shelter secure, she turned her attention to the tower's true purpose: water. The town's old well was long dry, but on her explorations of the land, she had discovered a small, reliable spring that trickled from the rocky hillside behind her property. The challenge was to move that water from the low spring up to the high tank. Her father had once shown her diagrams of a hydraulic ram pump, a brilliant, simple engine that used the force of falling water to pump a fraction of that water to a much greater height. It required no fuel, only a steady flow and a precise build. She spent her evenings in the lamplight of the pump house, sketching designs on sheets of brown paper, calculating flow rates and pressure differentials. For the fabrication, she needed a blacksmith. The town smithy was a surprisingly young and powerful woman named Mary, her arms corded with muscle from swinging a hammer. Mary was intrigued by Clara's detailed drawings, her sharp mind immediately grasping the mechanics of the device. Together, they forged the pump's components from raw iron stock. Mary would heat the metal to a glowing orange in the forge, and Clara would be there to check the angles and dimensions, their partnership a rhythm of fire, iron, and steam. They were two women in professions dominated by men, and they found a silent, powerful camaraderie in the shared creation of a functional, beautiful machine. To connect the spring to the pump, and the pump to the tower, they needed to lay hundreds of feet of pipe. A local farmer, Mr. Olson, a man whose land bordered hers, had been watching her progress with a reserved interest. He had a team of strong mules and a heavy trenching plow. He approached her one afternoon, tipping his hat. "Looks like you're doing good work, Miss Whitfield," he said. He offered the use of his team and the labor of himself and his 2 sons for a fair wage. For a week, the Olsen men and their mules carved a neat trench through the rocky soil. A straight, purposeful line connecting the source to the system. The day they pieced it all together was a quiet celebration of communal effort. Jebediah was there, as were Mary and the Olsens. Clara opened the sluice gate at the spring. Water rushed down the intake pipe, filled the pump chamber, and then, with a deep and resonant clunk, the ram pump began its cycle. A moment later, a second, heavier clunk echoed as the waste valve closed and the check valve opened. A steady stream of water, impossibly, began to flow up the long pipe toward the tank high above. A cheer went up from the small group. It was the sound of a heartbeat, a steady, powerful pulse, bringing life back to the heart of the iron giant. With the steady, rhythmic beat of the ram pump marking the passage of time, the great tank above began to fill, inch by silent inch. Clara's project and her place in Red Hollow began a slow and profound transformation. The water, she decided, was not just for her. The town was in the grip of a dry spell, and the new town well on the east side was sputtering, its output dwindling week by week. One morning, the people of Red Hollow awoke to find a new fixture at the base of the old water tower. Clara had run a secondary pipe down from the tank, fitting it with a simple, sturdy brass spigot set above a wide stone basin she and Jebediah had built. She made no announcement. The spigot was simply there, a quiet offering. The first person to use it was Sarah, Jebediah's wife, who arrived with 2 wooden buckets. She filled them with the clean, cool water, gave Clara a solemn nod of gratitude, and walked back to town. By noon, a small, orderly line had formed. The public tap became the new social center of the town's west end. Neighbors who had only ever exchanged passing greetings now stood together, waiting their turn, their buckets at their feet. They talked of the weather, of their struggling gardens, and they talked about the quiet, industrious young woman who had taken the town's most prominent piece of scrap and turned it into a source of life. Her name was no longer a curiosity. When she walked down the main street, people greeted her not as the strange tower girl, but with a newfound respect. "Morning, Miss Whitfield." It was a small change, but it felt momentous. She turned her attention inward, or rather, upward. She designed a living space for herself, within the vastness of the water tank. Below the level she intended to maintain for the town's supply, she framed out a small, 2-room apartment. Working with Jebediah, she insulated the walls against the cold of the iron and the heat of the sun. She cut 2 round windows into the thick steel, a difficult job that she and Mary the blacksmith accomplished with patience and a series of hardened chisels. The pump house became her permanent workshop, a place of tools and plans, while her home was a clean, bright nest suspended between the earth and the sky. Small rituals began to stitch her life into the fabric of the community. Mary started bringing a fresh loaf of her sister's bread every Saturday morning, and Clara, in return, helped the blacksmith organize her chaotic ledger of accounts. Mr. Olsen's sons would drop off a cord of firewood whenever they were cutting timber, refusing payment, but accepting a share of the water for their livestock. Sarah brought her a beautiful, hand-stitched quilt, its colors a warm defense against the cold winter nights to come. These were not acts of charity, but of exchange, the quiet, sturdy threads of a community, weaving itself together through mutual need and respect. The tower itself was transformed. It was no longer a skeletal reminder of a failed past, but a vital, functioning landmark. Its rusted exterior now seemed less like decay, and more like the patina of age on a venerable and useful object. It was a symbol of ingenuity and resilience, and its water was a daily blessing. Clara's authority in the town grew not from the money hidden in the chamber, which no one knew about, but from her undeniable competence. When the pump at the town's main well finally failed, its mechanism seizing with a terrible shriek of metal, the town mayor came to her, hat in hand. Clara went to the well, listened to the machine, and diagnosed the problem in under an hour. She and Mary worked together to forge a replacement part, and by the next day, the town well was working again. She was no longer an outsider. She was Red Hollow's engineer, its problem solver. She had taken an abandoned structure and made it a foundation, and in doing so, had built one for herself. The wind against the high tower was a constant, low hum, a sound that had become as comforting and familiar to Clara as her own breathing. She sat at the small table in her room inside the tank, a cup of warm tea steaming in her hands. Through the round window she had so painstakingly cut and sealed, she could see the scattered lights of Red Hollow twinkling in the deep blue of the evening. It was a town that had first pitied her, then whispered about her, and had finally, quietly, made a place for her. Her gaze drifted to a simple wooden shelf she and Jebediah had mounted above her small desk. On it, 3 objects sat in a neat, straight line, a trinity of her past, her present, and her future. At the left was the little wooden bird her father had carved for her so many years ago. Its basswood body was worn smooth from the countless times she had held it in her pocket, a silent, constant connection to his patient hands and the quiet love of the workshop. It reminded her of his most important lesson: to look past the surface of things, to see the potential for function and beauty in what others had discarded. In the center sat the brass sextant left behind by Elias Vance. It was a beautiful instrument, a tool for navigation, for finding one's precise place in a vast and often trackless world. She thought of Elias, the man she knew only through a few lines of careful script. He was a kindred spirit, another builder who had been wronged by the world, but had left behind a legacy of hope, a secret provision sealed in a shell of iron. He had found his own way to build a foundation for a future he would never see. To the right of the sextant was the small silver locket from his chest. Weeks ago, she had finally worked up the courage to open it. Inside, protected under a tiny circle of glass, was a faded, miniature portrait of a woman with kind eyes and a small, serious-looking girl with a ribbon in her hair. His lost family. It reminded her of the single, cracked photograph of her own parents that she kept in her satchel. She saw the connection then. 2 men, separated by decades, who had built things not for glory or for wealth, but to protect and provide for the people they loved. She thought, for a moment, of her Uncle Arthur. The memory brought no anger, only a quiet, distant sadness. He lived a life measured in profit and loss, his vision so narrowed by his ledgers that he was blind to the value of a person's skill or the potential hidden within a mountain of rust. He had given her $20 to be free of her. With that $20, she had purchased a world. She looked around her small, warm room, the lamplight glowing on the pine walls. Far below, the steady, rhythmic clunk-clunk of the ram pump was a gentle, reassuring heartbeat. Above her head, the immense weight of the water in the tank was a silent, heavy presence, a responsibility, a resource, a promise she kept to the town every day. She had built a home, not on the ground, but in the sky. She had built a life, not from what she was given, but from what was left behind. Clara Whitfield was 19, and had been cast out with nothing but a carved bird and $20 to her name. She spent it all on a rusted water tower that everyone said was worthless. It was the best $20 she ever spent.